This is Class 6 of the Contemporary European Security System, and today we're going to be discussing the EU, that is the European Union, as a foreign policy and security actor. And on this slide we have an article which I have sent to you, something that's very much in the news at the moment. The headline of which is How the Coronavirus Threatens Geopolitical Europe. So the last couple of weeks we discussed the way the concept of security has been broadened, the way some writers have argued that the traditional conception of security, which sort of has a realist view of international relations, which tends to emphasize or prioritize the military dimension of security. Some writers have argued that that approach is too narrow, that we face a multitude of other threats today which security, if it is to have any meaning, needs to take into consideration. And I think you could make the argument that the epidemic that we are currently experiencing sort of falls into this category. And yeah, the title of this article seems to kind of fit into that notion. How the coronavirus threatens a geopolitical Europe. The subheading there saying, after the crisis, the EU will face the same geopolitical problems it did before, but this time it might need to tackle them with less internal solidarity and external credibility. And in some ways, the article is going to be touch upon a couple of the points that we're going to need to consider today about the European Union and the degree to which we can view the EU as a sort of strategic actor in its own right. And I think there is a debate in the international relations literature on this, with some writers arguing that the European Union is becoming an increasingly powerful entity, and which is making which is having quite a strong influence on international politics, whereas others argue that there are, if you like, structural weaknesses within the European Union itself, which sort of limits its ability to perform the role of being a major strategic actor. So today we're going to kind of consider both sides of the argument. Before we do that, though, this slide is our sort of general introduction, which, the first point more or less sort of repeats what I just said. Opinion divided as to whether the EU can be considered a strategic actor. The one thing that is certain is that the EU has an incredible amount of economic power. So as a trading bloc, it is one of the world's largest. Its problem, though, is the sort of internal political weaknesses within it. The fact is that the European Union is not a state. It does not have a form of centralized government. So when it comes to policy formulation, particularly in the area of foreign policy and defense policy, the EU relies very heavily on consensus among its various member states, and often in the area of security and defense policy, foreign policy, consensus is quite hard to achieve. In fact, often incredibly difficult to achieve, simply because the various member states within the EU, and of course today the EU now includes 27 member states, used to be until fairly recently 28, but of course Britain has left the European Union, and that in itself has its sort of important consequences for the European Union in the defence and foreign policy spheres. But as I say, there are 27 member states, and this is quite a diverse collection of states. The EU now extends from the Mediterranean up to Scandinavia, from the Channel, La Manche, if you like, all the way through into to Poland, to East Central Europe. So yeah, a diverse group of states, diverse interests, all of them facing common, but also quite, in some areas at least, quite different security security problems. And in that environment, as I say, trying to achieve security, trying to formulate a coherent defence and security policy can be quite challenging. And arguably, we can see that at the moment in terms of the way that the European Union is responding to the pandemic, COVID-19. The EU has actually gained quite a lot of criticism simply because it hasn't, there hasn't been much in the way of a coordinated and coherent policy at the EU level. By and large, the various member states have had to cope with the epidemic more or less, on their own. They've implemented their own particular policies. So you've seen Britain arguably belatedly introduce a lockdown, other countries going much earlier. In contrast, Sweden taking a far more relaxed approach. And there hasn't been much in the way of EU solidarity in terms of the various member states coordinating their efforts, perhaps redistributing resources to those areas of the European Union which are most inflicted by this disease. So in some ways, as the EU's response to COVID-19 is quite a good case study in terms of the EU's overall response to this sort of crisis. It's not a particularly good example, I would say, of EU crisis management, and certainly the EU's critics, I would imagine, would argue that this is very much a consequence, as I say, of the EU's own internal political weaknesses. Now, the EU is often described as being a civilian power in the sense, as I mentioned a moment ago, it has, a large economic capacity. One of the world's biggest sort of trading blocks, one of the world's biggest markets, but relatively little in the way of sort of defence capabilities. So insofar that the European Union did have a fairly strong influence on international politics, it was usually as a consequence of its sort of economic leverage, but not so much the fact that it was capable of kind of projecting military power. Some EU member states, or member states of what was once the European Community, were, relatively speaking, fairly strong military powers. Of them all, Britain and France, quite notably, had some sort of capacity to project power. But defence and foreign policy were not seen as areas in which the European Community had much control over. That said, as the slide makes clear, from the beginning there were ambitions to develop some sort of defence dimension to the European Community, notably in the 1950s. We've touched upon this before, but there were proposals to establish a European defence community, which was basically going to be some kind of European army. Those plans eventually collapsed, but it was an early indication that there was, as I say, this sort of wider ambition to establish some kind of defence dimension to the European Community. In the 1970s, there was a slightly less ambitious idea, but this was known as European political European political cooperation, and this was the idea that the various member states, which went from 6 up to 9, with Britain, Ireland and Denmark joining in the early 1970s, that the various member states would try and coordinate their foreign policies. There would be regular meetings between European Community foreign policies, but it wasn't really a European foreign policy as such. And there was an acceptance that in terms of European security, NATO was going to remain the sort of preeminent security organisation on the continent. In terms of Europe's foreign policy, this begins to become more ambitious after the Maastricht Treaty comes into force in 1993. One of the so-called three pillars of the Maastricht Treaty was this idea that there would be a common foreign and security policy, a CFSP. And that basically required, again, similar to kind of European political cooperation, but there would be intergovernmental cooperation among the various member states when they were facing certain crises or challenges. Then, and Cotty's text does not go into this because it was published, I think, around 2006, 2007. But after 2009, when you have the signing and ratification of the Lisbon Treaty, the EU basically establishes a high representative of foreign affairs, which was basically the sort of deputy or second in command next to the president of the European Council. And this, I would say, kind of reflected this kind of wider ambition for the European Union to play a greater role on the world stage. Equally significant, you see the establishment of a European External Action Service, which is basically a sort of European foreign ministry or diplomatic corps. So basically you really see in the 90s, but particularly in the 21st century, and especially I would say after 2009, you're beginning to see the EU develop the various sort of apparatus and instruments that are necessary for it to start formulating something that resembles a foreign policy. So just as member states have their foreign ministries and foreign ministers, you're beginning to see something like the equivalent at the EU level as well. However, what is still notable is that when it comes to the kind of foreign policy formulation, ultimately the authority really rests with the 27 actual member states. And as I said a moment ago, this is a very diverse group of states spread right across the continent. The various member states have different sort of security needs and foreign policy interests. And as I say there, point number 3 here, for example, Poland's foreign policy interests very different from a country like Malta. Obviously, Poland, a frontier state, if you like, in the kind of European security community. Poland's primary security concerns tend to be focused eastwards in terms of having to sort of contain Russian activities within East Central Europe. Poland's relations with Ukraine, for obvious reasons, are extremely important. Things like that. You contrast Poland with, say, a country like Spain. Well, Spain, geographically much closer to North Africa. Spanish governments are going to be more preoccupied with problems stemming from radical Islamic groups operating in North Africa, crossing the Mediterranean into Europe, things like that. So given, as I say, that you have this fairly diverse collection of EU states, and unlike if you contrast the EU with, say, the United States of America, the one thing that is apparent is that the federal government in the United States has much, much more authority than, say, the European Council or the European Commission. So ultimately, the various member states in the EU are going to have a very, very powerful say in what kind of foreign policy is created. And as I say, it's quite hard to achieve consensus. And when you look at the various crises that the EU has had to respond to over the years, what we've seen is that often, in fact, I would say more often than not, that quite acute divisions have emerged among the various EU member states. It's also equally worth noting that various member states have sort of different foreign policy traditions. As I mentioned here, Britain, which until fairly recently was an EU member, was a member state that tended to prioritise the transatlantic connection between the European Union and the United States. Other countries, in contrast, have tended to emphasize their desire for having a more independent EU foreign policy. More independent, I mean, in terms of being independent from America, from the United States. So as I say, different traditions, different interests, and all these things mean that at times it's been quite difficult, as I said, to formulate a coherent and unified EU foreign policy agenda. Now, I would argue that this was clearly identifiable in the 1990s in terms of the way that the European Union responded to the war in Yugoslavia. The war in Yugoslavia basically sort of begins 1992, 1993. There's a prolonged crisis before that, but it more or less sort of coincides with the establishment of the European Union itself. So almost as soon as the ink sort of dries, let's say, on the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, the crisis sort of blows up in Yugoslavia. And what you see really is that Yugoslavia becomes the first major challenge for the European Union's common foreign and security policy. And I think you can see from the outset that the EU did not respond particularly effectively to this crisis. One reason for this was that there, as I said a moment ago, there were competing interests and traditions among the various EU states. For one thing, Germany, historically Germany had been a very close ally with Croatia, so almost as soon as Croatia announced that it was seceding from the Yugoslav Federation in 1992, the German government almost immediately recognized it diplomatically without consulting with any of its European partners. Other countries in the EU had historically been more sympathetic towards Serbia because they'd been wartime allies and were perhaps reluctant to come down too heavily on the Yugoslav government, at least in the early stages of the crisis. So these divisions were there right from the outset, and it became quite difficult. It became quite apparent that the EU was going to find it difficult to formulate a very effective and coherent policy towards Yugoslavia. Essentially, I think the decisions that were made in the early years of 92, 93, 94 essentially sort of reflected the lowest common denominator in terms of what was acceptable to the various sort of EU member states. Ultimately, the first wars in Yugoslavia only come to an end with the NATO intervention. You could make the argument that ultimately the EU, the crisis demonstrated that the EU was still pretty reliant on NATO and the United States when it came to managing these sort of crises. In 2003, 2002, 2003, when the United States first prepared and then launched its war against Iraq. Again, there were pretty acute divisions within the European Union. Those states in East Central Europe in 2003, they were not yet members of the European Union, but they would shortly be. So their membership had already been agreed upon. So countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc. This bloc of states were almost uniformly pro-American. Equally, there were other EU countries, the more established EU members, which also took a fairly pro-American policy during this crisis. These included Britain, Italy, Spain. But there were a number of countries, and notably what some writers at the time described as core Europe, that is France and Germany, who came out in opposition to the war. So Europe's, the intra-European divisions, 2002, 2003, were quite stark. With, as I said, France and Germany, despite being founding, in the case of France, a founding member of NATO. In the case of Germany, also a founding member of the European Community. These two countries nevertheless came out in public opposition and aligned themselves with Russia in the situation. 2011 again, and another crisis. This is in the wake of the Arab Spring in North Africa, the Middle East. When NATO decides to intervene in Libya, again, there were some divisions become apparent. On this occasion, it's Britain and France who are sort of spearheading the intervention against Libya. Other countries were notably much more reluctant to fully support the intervention. So Germany, for example, declined to make a military contribution, and so did, surprisingly, Poland. And I recently wrote an article about that, which was published. Poland, I think, being a fairly interesting case because in some ways it sort of seemingly went against its own sort of established tradition, which before 2010 at least had been sort of instinctively pro-American. But as I say, in 2011, Poland, like Germany, chooses not to directly contribute militarily to the intervention in Libya. Creating, there's a typing error I've just noted. Okay, so creating an effective EU foreign policy, it should read. I will try and remember to correct this slide. So all of this begs the question whether it is possible for the EU to implement an effective foreign policy. As I say, given that you have a large group, a very diverse group of member states, given these circumstances, is it remotely feasible for the EU to be able to come up with a sort of effective foreign policy in its own right? As I say, there is a debate underway about that. The examples on the previous slide seem to indicate that the EU found it quite hard to respond to a particular crisis. On the other hand, there have been arguments which suggest that over time you could witness a strengthening of the EU's foreign policy apparatus. Liberal institutionalists certainly make that argument, and I think Cottee, the textbook we're using, sort of falls into this camp. The argument here is that as the institutions are constructed and as the various sort of member states become increasingly sort of used to working through these institutions, you could expect to see the EU's capacity for implementing a foreign policy to be strengthened over time. And as I mentioned a moment ago, since the Lisbon Treaty, you're beginning to seize the sorts of institutions which are necessary for the European Union to conduct a foreign policy. So as I mentioned, there is now a High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs. There is now a European External Action Service. So, the EU is beginning to develop the sorts of tools that would be required for it to launch an effective foreign policy. The problem, though, I think, is still that the member states have the last say. And as I say, when responding to a crisis, there still needs to be some form of consensus, which is quite hard to achieve. So I suppose the interesting question it will be whether over time the High Commissioner would actually gain more and more authority to the point at which he could conceivably sort of either overrule one or two member states or perhaps use his influence or her influence. In fact, there's been two women high commissioners, to use his or her influence to actually kind of force or persuade the various member states to adopt a certain situation. As I said, there isn't much evidence of that happening to date, but it's not completely unreasonable to think that this is something that could actually happen in the future. But in that case, in this instance, only time would actually tell. As I mentioned in a previous slide, there are sort of competing traditions within the European Union, and two traditions that Cottee kind of notes, which I think do still have some validity. One is this notion of Euro-Atlanticism. The other is Euro-Gaullism. Obviously, Euro-Gaullism sort of refers back to Charles de Gaulle, the French president in the 1960s. A Euro-Atlantic approach essentially emphasizes the importance of the EU working closely with and possibly influencing the United States. So that basically this vision of the European Union is one in which it is part of a sort of wider transatlantic bloc, which I think was there from the beginning. In fact, if you look at the history of the way European integration develops from the late 40s through the 50s and 60s, I think from the outset there is this idea that the EU, that it's some sort of European federation, will kind of be part of or aligned with this wider sort of transatlantic bloc. However, there is a contrasting vision, which certainly de Gaulle in the 1960s promoted, and which still has its advocates today. This is a Euro-Gaullist vision, which basically sees the European Union as a sort of third force in world politics, basically more independent of the United States, perhaps more willing to counter the United States if it feels that American actions or American behavior is running contrary to European interests. And yeah, the Euro-Gaullist vision has certainly sort of raised its heads on a number of occasions. Notably, as I mentioned earlier, you see this in 2003 and the Iraq War. Arguably, the then French president Jacques Chirac and his foreign minister Dominique Villepin were very much sort of articulating a sort of Euro-Gaullist vision. At one point, I think Villepin sort of describes the United States as being some sort of rogue state, and this idea that the role of the European Union should be to try and kind of contain American behavior. As I mentioned, there are different traditions. Some countries from the outset have tended to be pretty sympathetic towards the United States, have sort of very much bought into this transatlantic conception. Britain would be a case in point. The British from the beginning have all had a sort of very close relationship with America, and when they joined the European community in the 1970s, the British vision is the British view themselves as a potential bridge between the United States and Europe. This is an analogy that Tony Blair made when he became Prime Minister at the beginning of the 21st century. Of course, the British are no longer in the European Union, and that will be quite interesting. As I say, the final point on the slide here is possibly the fact that Britain has exited the European Union means that the sort of transatlantic vision could weaken, and maybe a sort of more Euro-Gaullist vision could come to the fore. Certainly, Britain and France together were the sort of two sort of big global players within the European Union. With Britain having departed, perhaps France will have even more influence when it comes to shaping the EU's external relations. Other countries, as I say, they have tended to sort of move from one side to the other. So Spain during 2003, 2004 tended to be pretty pro-American. After 2004 elections, was it 2000 or 2005, I think? Anyway, after the elections, a socialist government came in, which was much more sort of skeptical about Spain's relationship with the United States. Germany historically has tended to be pretty pro-American, but less so than Britain, so it's tended to occupy a position somewhere between Britain and France on this issue. As I say, with Britain's departure, though, it's going to be interesting to see whether perhaps a sort of more Euro-Gaullist vision for Europe becomes more apparent. As with any state or entity, the EU's area of influence isn't going to be geographically uniform, in the sense that it's going to have more influence in some areas than others. And obviously those geographical regions which are closest to the EU, and you might argue are sort of closest to it culturally, are going to be more susceptible to EU influence than those countries which are more distant. So in that sense, probably the most important aspect of the European Union's external relations are its neighbourhood policies. So in terms of the neighbourhood, We're thinking in terms of North Africa, the Mediterranean area, and then into the Near East, which you could refer to as places like Turkey, Israel, Syria. So again, fairly close to the sort of Mediterranean region. And then obviously Eastern Europe. And as the first point says there, the main goal in terms of the EU's neighbourhood policies has basically been to try and stabilise the regions along the EU's frontiers. And I think it's fair to say the EU's had something of a mixed record when it comes to its neighbourhood policies. Its biggest success, I think, was in the 1990s and early 21st century, when a major part of its external relations was to help the Eastern European countries, post-communist countries in East Central Europe, make this transition from communism to liberal democracy and capitalism. From the outset, virtually all these countries wanted to become members of the European Union, so a big part of this project was to assist them making the necessary reforms and to prepare them for future membership. And this obviously culminates with the so-called Big Bang enlargement in 2004, when 10 countries are admitted into the European Union en masse. 8 of these countries coming from East Central Europe, including, of course, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltic states, etc., plus 2 small Mediterranean islands, Malta and Cyprus, were also admitted at the same time. And yeah, as I say, I think this can be kind of chalked up as a success in terms of kind of stabilizing the region, helping these countries make this transition to democracy. Since then, we've seen further enlargements in Eastern Europe with Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia also being admitted. And there is still, I think, a kind of ambition to bring in some more of the former Yugoslav republics. So it's possible that Serbia could be admitted in the not too distant future, Macedonia perhaps as well. Although that, as I say, that will sort of depend on the willingness of the governments within that region to embark upon the necessary reforms. But yeah, I think the enlargement in Eastern Europe can be sort of chalked up as something of a success story. Rather more complicated in recent years has been the Eastern Partnership. Of course, Poland has been one of the countries which has sort of Poland and Sweden, between them were the 2 architects behind the Eastern Partnership, the goal of which was sort of to intensify the EU's relations with a number of post-Soviet states in Eastern Europe, 6 of them, including Ukraine, which would lead ultimately to the possibility of creating the conditions where membership of the European Union might, in the long term, it should be said, but might one day be possible. This policy obviously ran into significant problems in 2013, 2014, when all 6 countries were offered association agreements with the European Union. When the Ukrainian president decided not to sign this agreement, it led to unrest, ultimately a revolution in Ukraine. A new, more pro-European government came to power in 2014, but that then sparked a Russian intervention, Russia's seizure of the Crimea, and unrest in 2 of Ukraine's eastern provinces, in the Donbass region of Ukraine. So the Eastern Partnership, I mean, as I say, one of the EU's goals has been to create stability in its neighbourhood. Well, the Eastern Partnership seemed to achieve the exact opposite of that, essentially. Essentially inducing Russia to kind of intervene in Ukrainian affairs, sparking revolution, and creating a sort of significant degree of sort of unrest and disturbance. So the Eastern Partnership, as I say, has something of a sort of mixed record. It's certainly sort of precluded the possibility of Ukraine becoming a member state of the European Union in either the near or I would say medium term. I think that's very much off the table now. And you've seen something quite similar, I think, in terms of the European Union's neighbourhood policies in terms of the Mediterranean and North Africa. Again, the idea in the 90s was to try and stabilise the region. In the case of North Africa, I don't think there was ever a sense that these countries could potentially become members of the European Union. So that as a possibility was never really on the table. It was never really a serious prospect, which in itself, I think, perhaps limited the EU's capacity to influence what was happening in the region. But yeah, like in Eastern Europe, there was this desire to promote stability through things like economic assistance and diplomacy and things like that. Of course, what we've seen in recent years, again, is the exact opposite of that. You had the Arab Spring, which created a series of revolutions in the region. Ultimately, that led to a NATO intervention, but although it was NATO spearheading the operation, the EU was very heavily engaged in the crisis in Libya. In fact, there was very famous pictures of the EU's High Commissioner, the then EU's High Commissioner of Foreign Affairs, Catherine Ashton, visiting Benghazi, which was one of the Libyan rebel strongholds around the crisis. Lots of EU flags actually being waved in Benghazi, which again was a sort of stark reminder that that in parts of the world there was considerable support or sympathy or invested in the European Union. But, since the intervention in Libya, conditions there have deteriorated to the point at which Libya has almost become a sort of failed state. The events in North Africa, Middle East have also led to the kind of migration crisis. And again, like the coronavirus, the migration crisis a few years ago, you could argue the EU didn't really respond particularly effectively. There wasn't a particularly coordinated policy among the various EU states. So again, like the Eastern Partnership, the Mediterranean Partnership, I think, has not really proved to be the sort of stabilizing force that I think the EU hoped that it would be. On the other hand, the European Union still remains pretty engaged in the region. One final thing to say about this, though, in terms of, again, Mediterranean, Middle East, Near East, there's the position of Turkey. Turkey has long desired to be a member of the European Union. So really, since the 1980s, I think Turkey have sort of have made it clear that they would like to secure EU membership. I forget the exact date, but at some point in the 1990s, anyway, Turkey was declared to be a sort of candidate member. So there's been this sort of notional idea that one day Turkey would become an EU member. Obviously, in recent years, that possibility, if anything, has sort of been reduced. There seems to be not much in the way of enthusiasm within the European Union for bringing Turkey into the Union. Equally, Turkey has become more authoritarian under Erdogan. Its human rights record, if anything, has become even more problematic in recent years. So the possibility of Turkey joining the EU seems increasingly remote for the time being, at least, which again is quite significant because, I mean, from a British perspective, one of the reasons, or one of the sort of most effective campaigns during the referendum Britain had on the European Union, the possibility of Turkish membership, that seems to have been a sort of factor which alarmed a sufficient number of British people to vote no. But as I say, the likelihood of that occurring in the near future seems to be pretty remote. aside from the EU's neighbourhood policies, then there's also the issue of the EU's capacity to kind of act at a global level. And in this regard, you could make the argument that the EU does have some influence, particularly in the economic organisation. So it's notable, for example, that the EU has a seat at the table in the World Trade Organization. So in the WTO, there isn't a German representative or a French representative, only an EU representative, which again is worth noting. So in the area of trade and economic affairs, you could argue that the EU does actually wield a significant amount of institutional influence in various international organizations, as I say, most notably the WTO. EU also does have important bilateral relations with other countries like India, China, Japan. Again, trade is the one area where the EU can exert a significant amount of influence, simply because the various member states within the EU don't have their own trade policies, but instead, act through the European Union. Then again, as I think we've discussed in other classes, there's a very strong institutionalized transatlantic relationship between the EU and the United States. For a time, that looked like it could even be strengthened with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which was proposed. But the Trump administration withdrew from that, so that project has collapsed. This idea that there would be some sort of transatlantic trading area, transatlantic trade bloc for the time being, at least. That seems that does not look like it's going to necessarily come into existence. European Union also cooperates with other regional organisations, so it has contacts with other regional blocs. So ASEAN, which is the group of Asian states, the African Union, its equivalents in South America, things like that. More generally, the EU, as says there, the EU has sought to promote global institutions or sort of work through global institutions. So if you like, the sort of EU philosophy is to encourage sort of multilateral cooperation. So it obviously has quite close links with organizations such as the United Nations, these sorts of institutions. So the EU, by its nature, obviously, in terms of its in terms of the people who work within it and their philosophy, by their very nature, they are going to be sort of institutionalists. Cotti also mentions that the EU does play a sort of limited role when it comes to conflict prevention and crisis management, although, as we've seen, the EU's capacity there is perhaps more limited than it is in the kind of economic sphere. Also, if you think things like climate change, environmental degradation, if you think these are security issues, then you could certainly make the argument that the EU plays an important role in things like international negotiations on climate change, the various UN summits, meetings that have been organised. Again, the EU the EU represents all the member states en masse. So again, there is not a French position on climate change or Polish position, but all these countries are sort of represented at the EU level, and the EU participates as a bloc in these sorts of talks. Okay, and then we have a little map here, which I've copied and pasted. The link is in the PowerPoint. But yeah, European Union and CSDP missions. CSDP standing for Common Security and Defence Policy missions. Missions and operations in 2020. And again, you can see on the map that there is a sort of fairly wide sort of geographical spread in terms of EU involvement. It notes here that there are 6 ongoing military missions and operations in different parts of the world. Some of the most significant are Kosovo, I would say, is probably the most significant and probably the geographical area that the EU has been most heavily involved with, but also in parts of North Africa as well. The map also mentions that there are 11 ongoing civilian missions and about 5,000 people currently deployed. I think this includes both military and civilian personnel. And again, as the map sort of illustrates, most of these are either in Europe itself or in sort of North Africa, perhaps Central Africa, as well as Iraq as well. So, geographical areas which are fairly close, let's say, to the sort of European neighbourhood. The fact, as I say, in total 5,000 people kind of indicates that these are fairly sort of small scale operations. As I say, of them all, probably Kosovo is the sort of most significant. The EU peacekeepers and civilian personnel basically replaced UN military forces after the conflict in Kosovo came to an end there. And more generally, I think you can say that the EU has been very sort of closely involved in the former Yugoslavia during and after the wars came to an end in the 1990s. So as I say, EU has had a significant sort of peacekeeping element to it, but as I say, it's pretty small scale, so it's important not to kind of emphasise. As I say, main areas have been the Balkans, especially Kosovo. EU has focused on peacekeeping operations, nation building, civilian aspects of crisis management. Cotti says that in his book. What we haven't really seen much of, though, is EU forces being involved in high intensity sort of combat, warfare, anything like that. So, as I say, these are relatively small scale policing operations. There's certainly been an ambition, though, really, I suppose, from the late 1990s onwards, to give the EU some kind of capacity to deploy military forces beyond its frontiers. Today, I checked the website today, and apparently there are now 18 battle groups. A battle group is a sort of battalion size, I think, so probably about 500 personnel. So there are 18 battalions that can be put together by EU member states that can actually be deployed beyond EU frontiers. At any moment, I think there are basically 2 battalions on standby, which can be sort of deployed fairly quickly if a crisis breaks out. But again, I mean, this is, in comparison to the sort of military force that the United States, for instance, can wield, this is pretty, this is extremely limited. The other thing to add to that is that Brexit will almost certainly have significantly reduced the EU's military capacity, because Britain, along with France, was the one state which had any sort of major capacity to project military force beyond its own frontiers. So Britain's departure from the European Union will almost inevitably significantly sort of weaken the EU's capacity when it comes to projecting military force beyond its own frontiers. Final section we'll just quickly mention is the area of freedom, security, and justice. So this is basically sort of internal security within the European Union. And I would argue here that kind of so-called soft security issues kind of come under the EU auspices in this particular area. So we're talking about things like organised crime, immigration, police cooperation, terrorism. This area was, again, one of the pillars of the Maastricht Treaty, and the idea being basically to sort of allow the various member states to kind of coordinate their policies, to get their law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies to kind of cooperate and coordinate their activities with one another. This became obviously particularly important after the Schengen Agreement came into force, because that basically removed border controls between the various EU member states. So you have free movement of people right across the European continent. So it became more necessary for there to be higher levels of cooperation between, as I say, the various sort of police departments, law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies. However, again, point that Cotti makes, and I think it's still true today, is that the level of coordination has still been fairly limited. It's generally speaking, security, policing, things like that are still more or less sort of organised along national lines, and as I say, the level of cooperation is sort of rather limited. One thing that both the migration crisis and the coronavirus crisis have shown is that border controls can actually be quickly restored. So when the virus started to spread across Europe, most countries on the European continent, including Poland, re-established sort of border controls and monitored who was crossing frontiers, and that will raise an interesting question of the extent to which these borders will actually be removed, even after the current crisis eventually, hopefully, sort of dies down. Whether it will be possible or how quickly it will be possible to get back to a sort of borderless Europe, that will be quite interesting to see. So kind of to conclude, to sum up, what we have seen in the last 20 years is certainly a sort of ambition for the European Union to play a greater role on the world stage. That's certainly been reflected in, if you like, the institutional transformation of the European Union. As I say, there is now a high representative of foreign affairs. But I think the EU's critics have sort of argued that when you look at how the EU has sort of responded to various crises, you don't get the sense that you're witnessing some kind of European federation with as I say, a reasonably coherent and effective foreign policy responding to these sorts of events. Instead, you get a sense of a group of member states attempting, but often not being overly successful when it comes to trying to coordinate their various policies. And as I say, things like coronavirus and Yugoslavia in the 1990s have kind of demonstrated that there have been some fairly evident shortcomings when it's when it's come to the area of, as I said, formulating a European foreign policy as such. And I think I will leave it at that.